for our panelists. And Paul, as you've just joined us, I've got one on the port and the maritime operations. So for Paul and also Michelle, if you'd like to answer this too. Given the effects of climate change will require responding to rising sea levels, more extreme weather events and pressure on biosecurity, environmentally friendly materials, and etc., how vulnerable are maritime operations along the Great Southern Coast, and how can maritime transport and exploration adapt to this?
Thanks, Diane, and thanks, ladies and gents. It's a good question. And being on the waterfront, the interface between the land and the sea, obviously we were very vulnerable to the impacts of sea level rise and increased storm frequencies and events. So there is both positive and negatives in a sense, without being contrite. One of the positives is the sea level rise does give us a little more draft. It means we can reduce our requirement for dredging. However, that comes with a whole heap of other risks and costs in relation to overtopping of our infrastructure. You know, we get waves set up and that sort of stuff, and a lot of impacts there. So a lot of work in adaptation. We're working with the City of Albany locally with our port to look at the coastal hazard risk mapping as well. So in a nutshell, that's kind of where we're at. So yeah, it's a big issue for us, and we are certainly planning. Pretty well placed locally in Albany as a port, but certainly some of our other ports, particularly maybe Esperance, more exposed. So certainly their vulnerability will be increased in terms of the time frame and ours vis-a-vis.
Good. Michelle, would you like to say anything?
Sure. I think, from my perspective, this is one of the reasons that we need to observe the system and understand how it's changing and how fast it's changing, so that we can actually mitigate these things where we can. Industry can plan around it. We can make sure that they can still operate efficiently and effectively. If we can collect the data that helps us underpin the models that forecast what the conditions will be, then they can adjust their operations as need be. We're going to have to keep adjusting to these things, and industry is already doing that. So some of the shipping industries now are using wave and current data to reroute their vessels, and so some of them are taking longer routes as you go, but by not having to punch against the waves and using the current, they can actually arrive at the port at the same time and use less fuel. So I think being smarter about how we operate and understanding the conditions we're operating in, we can actually do better in the long run.
Excellent, thank you. Please, if anybody does have a question, just wave your arm at me or speak up or something. Yes? Karen.
Thanks. This is a question for Irene. Just wanting to perhaps a little bit more information about you saying the push for aquaculture into the offshore. Rather, is that a reflection of the environmental damage that aquaculture is occurring?
Thank you very much. I think that there's a couple of things. One is a need for more aquaculture production. Our wild catch fisheries has been depleting in Australia, and one of the ways in which we can help support food security is to look at aquaculture. I do believe that the CRC's focus is on Commonwealth waters, and that's not about trying to transfer the issues that they've had in the coastal zone in sheltered waters offshore, but that's about doing it much more sustainably. And one of the ways in which we see that we can help support that is with not only a regulatory framework that is underpinned by having really clear environmental management protocols in place, but also actually supporting them to look at the way in which they use that infrastructure to farm offshore, and actually improving that infrastructure, making it more robust, looking at the way we can decarbonise the materials that they use, decarbonise the way in which they feed fish, the way in which we integrate it with other aquaculture production. So seaweeds is one of the areas that we think have an opportunity to help the ecosystem. It's a filter actually for aquaculture, and I think that it's a great opportunity for us as well in Australia to actually help support new industries to grow. I actually think that one of the biggest challenges has been the regulatory environment, and that's one of the things that we think the Blue Economy CRC has the opportunity to actually change, and to really use, I think, world-class research to help inform better policy, regulation and environmental management for aquaculture.
Jude, would you like to? Oh.
Thank you. So I guess just from my perspective in response to that is just to highlight that not all aquaculture is the same, and shellfish aquaculture in particular
is a form of restorative aquaculture. So the shellfish farming actually gives quite a lot of ecosystem services that benefit the environment, and so we're really focusing on that here in Albany. So shellfish obviously are filter feeders, you know, they clear the water column. That has benefits for the seagrasses. They also, you know, it's nutrient cycling that benefits those seagrass populations as well. And the shellfish farms also provide a lot of habitat to fish and for nurseries. So, you know, we're definitely sort of highlighting those environmental benefits. And from Harvest Row's perspective, sustainability is really at the heart of what we do. Lewin Coast brand is the first aquaculture brand in the country that has been certified carbon neutral, climate active. We've actually even got Adrian here today from the Australian Marine Conservation Society, and he's actually visiting Albany at the moment to undertake a sustainability assessment of our operations down here. So I think he's volunteered to answer any questions anyone has about sustainability with regards to particularly to Harvest Row's operations, but also what he does in terms of assessing aquaculture operations and their sustainability credentials. Adrian?
Yeah, look, I'd be happy to. Hello, well, I've been dropped a hot one there. Thank you, Jude. Yeah, certainly happy to talk through any of those issues. I think Jude makes an important point that not all aquaculture is the same. Shellfish aquaculture in particular is some of our most environmentally efficient ways to produce animal protein. Yes, there are impacts. There's a range of benefits as well. I'm here assessing Harvest Row's performance as part of our own seafood guide program, which sets a pretty high environmental bar, and I'll be running that all over those operations as well. But unsurprisingly, they're a pretty professional outfit, and the way they're treating the habitats and seagrasses and listening to the environments of Albany is looking pretty good so far. Thanks, Jude. But happy to field any questions later.
Thanks, Adrian.
I guess just following up on that, I'm interested to know what are the possibilities for Albany? What other aquaculture activities could we do here? And what are those, I guess, the hurdles that we'd have to overcome to do that? You know, Jude or...
I think at this stage the focus in Albany is really on shellfish. So the South Coast Aquaculture Development Zone, which is a government initiative down here, is solely for shellfish production. And the process that was undertaken to identify Albany as the ideal location for that zone involved a survey of the entire coastline from Augusta all the way out to Euclid. And there were only 2 locations that were deemed really suitable for shellfish aquaculture, and some of the reasons behind that are obviously environmental, and which areas provide, you know, the estuarine environments, also the marine environments, the sheltered waters, but also the proximity to the development, the workforce, the services, and the other regional industries that aquaculture development needs. So Albany is kind of really critical for the development of the shellfish industry in WA. As far as I'm aware, there's no plan to make the South Coast Aquaculture Development Zone available for any other species, and we're really focusing on shellfish here in Albany.
Irene, I was just interested to know if you had any ideas for what else might happen in Albany or your experience.
I think, first of all, I think one of the hurdles is the regulatory environment, and I think that Jude's right. I think before you're going to introduce any other species into an environment, you have to understand the implications of doing that. Some of the research that we intend to do is to look at those aquaculture species, look at the environmental conditions, look at what naturally grows in this area before we were going to even consider any other type of production. I think one of the examples that I would give, at least that's relevant to Tasmania, is that many of the oyster farmers are also doing seaweed production as well. And so that's one of the things that we think actually is a good integration of two species within one ecosystem that actually supports each other quite well. So people are looking at oysters, mussels and seaweeds generally. And so that's one of the areas that I think could be an opportunity here in Albany.
Thank you. Now I'd like to switch back to the renewable energy, and Christophe, you did present that quite well. It was really good to hear that. Now the roadmap towards net zero emissions by 2050 doesn't limit fossil fuels. It includes carbon capture and relies on developing more cost-effective solar technologies. First, I'm just interested in what are the enablers for ocean energy resources to deliver on its potential, and what are the challenges? So where can we go with this?
I think I'm going to echo what Irene just said. I think the major order so far has been the regulatory framework, to actually enable this project offshore, and that's the energy bill basically, which is going to Parliament now, is going to be a very significant step forward. What's missing as well is probably an incentive market for investors to occupy that field, basically, and Star of the South, the success of Star of the South, which we all hope, is going to be a major milestone, I hope, to bring confidence to the different investors that there is actually market and opportunities in that space. What's missing as well is it's a political will. There is no objecting to that. There was an audit recently made by the US Department of Energy to understand why Denmark, the country, was world leader in wind energy, and the US were not, for a country which is 10 times the size and so on. And the result of that audit was that Denmark had a consistent support policy over 3 decades towards offshore renewable energy. While the US basically were pouring a lot of money one year and go back to zero the next year, and some money one year, and so this inconsistency, discouraged private investors basically, and the lack of visibility was extremely damaging for private investors in that space. So I think we need that. We need a supportive regulatory framework. We need an incentive market system, probably a tax-intensive incentive system for investors, and a very clear policy from the state and federal government to support this energy. Once we've got that, I think we can make some very significant progress, because we are very fortunate to have some very significant strength in that space. So as has been highlighted, we've got these world-class resources in wave, wind, and tidal, which are limitless. What I mean by that is that they're here forever. You're not depleting reservoirs when you're actually extracting them. And their capacity exceeds by 1 order, if not 2 orders of magnitude, the demand in the country. So the second big advantage, and Irene has mentioned that as well, is that we've got a world-class expertise in ocean engineering that has been built over the last 3 decades with the oil and gas industry. And it's true both in the research sector and the industry sector. And then the third advantage is that we actually have a very dynamic network of SMEs in that space. Companies that basically have been created in Perth here and in Australia, in wave, tidal, and wind space. And so in that basically are to push forward this technology and so on. So we've got all these opportunities and advantages. If we put in place the right incentive framework, I think we've got a fantastic opportunity for Australia not only to be leader in that space, but also to actually generate a significant export industry, in ocean renewable energy.
I'll just add something in support of that, Christophe. And that's probably that we relied very heavily on the government, the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, to support R&D development for the offshore renewable energy sector in Australia. And it's not always been part of their emerging renewables program that wave, tidal and offshore wind was at the highest, most important part of their strategy. And I think that's had an impact on innovation in Australia. And so that's what we're trying to correct, at least with the funding that we have in the Blue Economy CRC and the wave, tidal, offshore wind engineering research partners that we have that are world class that can help support us to solve those problems. I'd say also that if it wasn't for ARENA, we wouldn't understand what our wave resource is, we wouldn't understand what our tidal resource is, and with the CRC this year, we wouldn't have understood what our wind resource is. And one of the biggest challenges is if we can't characterise that and explain to people what the benefit of bringing their investment to Australia is, they're not going to bring it. And the risk for investors, the risk for industry is going to be really, really high. And so I think that you've got to have two things. You've got to have funding that supports research and development. You've got to have funding that helps support emerging technologies to be developed here in Australia so that we can learn the good and the bad of what happens when you build these devices, deploy them, operate them, decommission them. And that's what the M4 project will do. And for that knowledge to be actually shared quite widely and openly so that people can understand that it's actually really challenging operating in the marine environment, and sometimes everything doesn't go according to plan. And so we need to actually work through this process. So we need government and we need others to help us support that process. And it's been wonderful, in fact, in 2019 to have the Cooperative Research Centre program, which is the biggest funded research program in Australia, give us $70 million to look at this, and industry to put in the remaining $181 million in their time, their resources, their cash investment to actually make this happen. So I think that we're now in a really good place with the new regulatory framework to actually see this happen. And I think that there's no reason why offshore energy can't play a role in Australia's energy mix. There's no reason why we can't work to our greatest advantages that are all regional advantages. Albany, as Christophe said, has specifically got some of the best wave tidal and offshore wind resources. But we go further north and we would probably not look at wind, but we'd look at solar and tidal, for example. And these are the sort of things that I think we have not been considering in Australia so far.
Thank you. Irene, put this one to you too. You've got this data. You're working with some government. Sorry, not Irene. Michelle.
Yeah.
Michelle, put this one to you as well, because I'm looking for some positive responses here. We're talking a lot about regulatory environment. We need some changes at a government level. Now, you're working with some government bodies. They're interested in the data you've got. Give me some hopeful signs that this is working.
Look, I think, we're learning to work together better. One of the things that I say to people, through IMOS we make our data openly available and we share it. And, we're a small country in a lot of ways. And if we don't start sharing our data better, if we don't get industry to share data and government to share data and researchers to share data, we'll keep competing with each other and we'll keep losing collectively. So I think we're learning to work together better. Industry's trusting research more and not having to control and do everything themselves. I mean, the CRC is a good example of how industry is walking towards these opportunities. Government is getting on board, starting to make some of their data available, starting to join in and support these programs. So I think it's just a process, and it's in some ways it's people changing their mindset about how we're going to work. And these big collaborations and being more open and cooperative, I think, is really the way forward for us to do more as a country and make sure that we can, compete with and catch up with, Europe and the US and other countries that are moving further ahead in some of these areas than we have been.
I see. Now, any questions out in the audience? Yes.
Fantastic presentation so far. I'm Paul Herrick from CEO. How far, this is probably a very difficult question. There's been lots of research being done on wave energy, but how far away, realistically, are we from having, at scale, wave energy being produced somewhere in the world, preferably, obviously?
That's a difficult question indeed. I think we can learn a lot from what we've seen in the offshore wind space, and so it's actually very well documented. So it took about 3 decades to actually have an industry now which is fully commercially viable and that generates energy at a price which is extremely competitive. There is no reason why the wave energy and the tidal energy industry could follow the same trend. It's all going to depend about the level of investment that's going to be poured into it, to enable basically this development that are required. But we know what are the levers to play with. We need economy of scale, we need improved technology. One thing which is also important to understand in that context is that wave energy has also a diversity of technology which enables it to actually occupy different markets. you know. So it's not necessarily the solution to connect to the grid and provide 5 gigawatts of electricity to power PER for Albany, you know. But it has specific markets for local communities, for microgrid development and so on, in which it's going to be extremely competitive, or displacing diesel in local communities, in which it's going to be extremely competitive. So what we need is basically the level of investment in research and technology development that's going to help us, you know, going through that cost reduction curve as rapidly as possible. And again, you know, this market opportunity that we need to investigate and so on. So the time, I would say, some people say 10, 15 years, you know, before it has reached maturity, and we've got actually something that is going to be a part of the energy portfolio.
I have to agree with everything that Christophe has said.
Thanks, Irene. I appreciate that.
But also because it actually does take having the right solution for where wave energy makes most sense. I'll provide a context that's not in Albany, but in Tasmania, King Island has a microgrid that has onshore wind and solar, and a company called Waveswell Energy has built a structure, a wave energy device that sits on the seabed. That's basically a hollow chamber that water goes in and out of, and they've been able to now successfully produce wave energy into a microgrid on King Island now for the last 6 months, and they're going to continue to do that for another 6 to 12 months. When I visited King Island a couple of weeks ago and I met with Hydro Tasmania and I walked through the microgrid, you know, they rely on diesel as a backup, but they mostly use wind and a bit of solar, and now wave. And when we were talking about where in their network they have end-of-grid connection issues, or they could do with more renewables, they pretty much told us exactly which location on King Island would be best in terms of their experience, in terms of the onshore grid. And they also told us exactly how much additional renewable energy that they need, and that they felt really excited about the fact that wave energy could supply that. So I think that once you've got all those different factors coming together, meeting in the middle, I think that the solution is there, and the technology, I think, is there, and we just have to continue to support these trials to be developed. And so that device is 200 kilowatts. They're going to learn a lot from deploying that device in a not sheltered location completely, but it's certainly not as exposed as the west side of King Island is to the Southern Ocean, but their technology readiness will have increased so much that now they're going to go from 200 kilowatts to a megawatt, and that will be all that King Island needs. So these are the kind of examples that I think we need to look to say, there's one that we've had success with that's had a really good solution. And I actually think that the same goes for what Christophe's team and the Blue Economy CRC and all the other partners are doing, and the government is doing here in Albany, and I think it's not that far away.
Excellent. Any questions yet or further? So I'll just keep going here. I've got plenty. Paul, another one for you. We're hearing a lot about different new technologies and new opportunities in the oceans. Now, of course, this brings up the issue of biosecurity. How will the port manage biosecurity into the future with so many new activities and new developments happening in our area?
Thank you. If I may, be controversial and challenge esteemed colleagues here in relation to the time frame. I think something I see in the tech, just as a layperson on the side, the convergence of the wave with the floating offshore wind is a really exciting development. And I think that's already proven technology, or it's starting to be quite proven technology. So I think that acceleration over that time frame could be very real. So keep the enthusiasm and energy going, and let's get there. So that's my provocation to all of you. Just an aside. But in terms of biosecurity, I'll tell you what, I'll do a deal with Michelle. Michelle, if you can explain eDNA and metabarcoding to the crowd, I'll explain the Albany and the statewide array program. Can we do a deal?
Yeah.
Okay.
eDNA, it's environmental DNA. It's a process where you can collect a water sample, run that water sample through a filter, and then process that filter to pick up genetic animals shed cells all the time. We all shed cells, so you can pick up those cells on the filter, they can process them and actually find out, identify which animals were in the area that you collected the water sample from. So this process is, the eDNA process is collecting those samples and then using the barcoding, which is basically how you know who's who based on their genetic makeup to determine what animals were in the area when you collected the water sample. Does that make sense?
Thanks, Michelle. You can see why I left Michelle to answer that question. But in terms of the Albany and I guess the state response to the eDNA and the utility of that, it's really revolutionised the way we do biosecurity monitoring in this state. In fact, we're probably in the cutting edge of that, both a national and state award winner for our biosecurity monitoring program. And that's a collaboration between our colleagues in DPIRD, primary industry research and development, regional development, thank you. And in particular, the biosecurity, the marine biosecurity branch, Justin McDonald's group, collaboration with all the state port authorities, the 5 of them, Kimberley, the Pilbara, Midwest, Fremantle and Southern Ports, together. Been running this program for 5 years now, and it's the only one in the world where a full jurisdiction has complete coverage from its entire coastline. And we have 2 seasons of monitoring, so we get 4 months of this monitoring, as opposed to one day snapshot with traditional monitoring. So we have much better sort of temporal coverage, and the results are really, really encouraging. And in fact, we're trying to share that knowledge with other jurisdictions. They're trialling it in Queensland, and what I'd like to see personally, it's not my business view, but personally is that system rolled out nationally, because it's quite economical, it's very efficient, it's rapid, and it's a set of eyes and a sentinel out in the water. So yeah, I'm going to be pushing that and push that as hard as we can, to get a national system up, and we'll advocate for that for sure.
Thank you. Well, I'll just ask one more question to each of our panelists. Now, this whole session has focused a lot on sustainability and on the coming climate crisis that's coming up. I guess just in addition to anything you've said up to this point, what's your idea for how the blue economy and Albany and maybe other regional areas will manage this or can make the best out of it? What's the future for us? Where should we be going as just residents of the area? What are the things that we could focus on to try to assist and make the blue economy work better for all of us? I'll start with Jude.
That's a pretty tricky question, actually. Look, I think from Harvest Row's perspective and from our experience in trying to get what is a pretty large-scale development off the ground here in Albany, I would say that one of the things that regional communities can do is really be open to new things, to change, and really supportive and seeing the kind of future opportunities that exist around some of these new developments that might be a bit of a shock to some people. So we've really been focusing on explaining all the knock-on benefits that will come off the back of our development in terms of jobs and partnerships with businesses and benefits to regional industries and also tourism and culinary opportunities that come off the back of aquaculture. So I guess seeing the big picture of all those kinds of opportunities that exist for regional communities, because I think one of the things that regional communities really need is economic development. I think that's really important in WA. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Thanks, Jude. Yeah, from my perspective, and it's my personal perspective, and we are working with sustainability and I guess our master planning internally at the port. And I'd have to say, given Albany's globally significant and very compelling endowment in terms of our wave and wind resource, I would very much like to see utility scale offshore renewables driving our region, green hydrogen, fueling our wonderful agricultural systems, replacing diesel, and absolutely transforming and starting to regenerate and invest back in our region through the benefits that will bring and decarbonising our economy.
I'm going to take a very different tack tack, I think. And I'm going to say, I think the regional areas and the regional, you're a community. You know, you have an opportunity to work together, to connect and to collaborate to achieve, you know, a greater good delivery. I met on Monday with a group of stakeholders. You all live here together. You all know each other. You can connect with each other. You can work together to achieve some of these objectives, which can be much harder in metropolitan areas where, you know, people are spread. You've got a lot of different people you have to connect with to actually make those partnerships and make things happen. So I think you have a huge opportunity and an advantage in the regional areas by being able to know each other and work together collectively to create benefit for your community. So I think that's a real strength for you here.
Thank you. Goodness, they've stolen my points. I'm going to then add something else on, I think, and that is that I think we need to remember that we need to work not only with the local community, but consider the social and cultural licence issues when it comes to expanding development, and to really take the time, I think, to work with all the different stakeholders and the sectors to achieve what I think is the right solution for Western Australia. And I don't have what that solution is. I think we need to work that out together through the research that we do, by talking with industry, the community, by local government, councils, etc. And I think that we should always work to our regional advantages, and I think that Paul has picked those up really nicely. Work to what our greatest advantage is in terms of our local resources, our local industry capability, and obviously Paul supports a very strong engineering capability through his port, and also supports a large economic sector in terms of the transport sector, and actually helping support, you know, Albany Port and even some of the other regional ports to decarbonise is probably one of the things that I'd love to see occur as an outcome of the Blue Economy CRC. I think we, at least in the CRC, have a significant investment that we want to make in Western Australia, and we want to do that in regional areas. And so we're open and interested to talk with people who want to work with us to achieve that.
Thank you. What is left for me to say? So I think there is two aspects. I mean, the first one is that the community here has been extremely supportive so far of our initiative in that space, and I'm very grateful of that. It's been really enjoyable to be here and work and engage with the community. I think as a community, I think we actually need to be a bit more vocal about what we want. But I guess that's the French in me talking, who likes to protest and be vocal about things, you know. But it's clear that we need to put pressure on our governments, on our people making the decisions, you know, to be extremely clear about what we want for our future. So that's one thing. More pragmatically, I mentioned these fantastic resources we've got here. You know, I mean, how do we use that to the best advantage? The thing with energy is that the big problem with energy is storage and transport. You know, and so that's why oil is fantastic, because basically you just put that in a barrel and you know, it's stored and transported. So how do we transform this energy and resources we've got into something basically that can be transported and stored easily? And that's where hydrogen is potentially a fantastic opportunity. Yeah. So I think what I would like to see for this region is to look at this gigawatt of resources sitting there, and what is the plan to transform that into a nitrogen export industry that would support the community here. That's a big plan, you know, and that's going to require the engagement of everybody at all levels, basically, to push toward that. But I think there is an amazing opportunity.
I really just want to thank our presenters. I appreciated the last question there and your responses, just saying how important it is that community works together, collaborates, be clear about what our expectations and our desires are, and be there to support these industries when they come forward and they do it in such a sustainable way. I think there's a bright future ahead for us, and I really want to thank Jude, Paul, Michelle, Irene, and Christophe for coming along tonight to share your knowledge and your experience with us.